So last week I recorded a video, and that video was about how to find a good therapist. And in the comments section of that video, some folks asked me to expand on something I talked about, which was theoretical points of view and specifically about cognitive behavioral therapy. I don't know if you can tell by looking around my room, but I'm a little bit of a nerd and I tend to dive deep into subjects, and I'm really passionate about CBT and I'm passionate about therapy. And I ended up creating a video that was much too long and much too intricate and just completely boring and wouldn't have been of very much interest to anyone other than a nerd like me. So I am going to write a Substack post and put a link to it in the description below. So if you're very interested in the history of psychology and how one theory interrelates and impacts another, you can head on over to that Substack link and read about it. But this video will hopefully be much more succinct and focus exclusively on what cognitive behavioral therapy is, and I'm going to refer to that from here on out as CBT, and how it might help you and how you might go about determining whether or not it's the right type of treatment for you. CBT was essentially a reaction to behaviorism. That's not entirely true. CBT integrated the ideas of behaviorism into itself. And why do I bring up behaviorism when I just got done telling you I'm not going to go into the history of psychotherapy? Well, I think it is important to understand that behaviorism was a type of therapy that said, or a type of theoretical approach that said, there is just stimulus and response. I don't want to pay attention to anything that's going on in the mind. There's just what happens that I can observe, and we introduce a stimulus, we get a response. We ring a bell, we serve the dog food, the dog salivates. We ring a bell, we serve the dog food, the dog salivates. It was an attempt to develop a theory that was much better at predicting behavior than theories that had preceded it. Now, the problem with that, of course, is as follows. It becomes very difficult to predict human behavior. Given the same stimulus, two humans are not going to have the same response. And so behaviorism kind of fell apart. And what CBT did is it integrated this third thing: stimulus, thought, that is cognition, and response. It said, really, what describes or impacts our emotional and behavioral outcomes has to do a lot with how we think about things and not so much just about the stimulus. So the way that I kind of illustrate this to clients is, let's just imagine that the two of us are teleported to Six Flags Magic Mountain, to any amusement park, pick your amusement park, and we're standing and looking at a roller coaster. It's the newest, fastest, scariest roller coaster they have. You may look at that stimulus. We're both experiencing the same stimulus. You may look at it and go, I'm really excited. I feel excited to ride that roller coaster. And your behavior may be to go and get in line to ride the roller coaster. Whereas I may look at it and feel very fearful or anxious about what might happen. And I will go and get a pretzel because I'm not interested in feeling that fear. So in this example, the two of us are experiencing the same stimuli and getting very different responses, both emotional and behavioral. And what explains that? Well, what explains it, as most people understand, is how we think about that roller coaster. So, for example, you might look at that roller coaster and have a very fond memory of your riding a roller coaster with your grandfather, or just feeling how exciting it was to ride that roller coaster, and thus that prompts in you an excitement to ride it now, and you go get in line. Whereas I may not even have a memory about a roller coaster. I may just have a visual image in my mind of myself flying out of the roller coaster and smacking on the ground and dying. And that generates anxiety in me. So CBT basically says if we address those cognitions in between the stimulus and the response, we'll get a different emotional outcome and a different behavioral outcome. And CBT does this in 4 ways. There are 4 potential aspects to CBT that I'll try and cover in 5 minutes. The first one is called cognitive restructuring. And what does that mean? There are really 2 aspects to cognitive restructuring. The first aspect is helping clients to identify what it is they're thinking. Most of us engage in what we would refer to as thought habits. We've sort of learned certain ways of thinking about ourselves, certain ways about thinking about the world and about others. And our mental processes follow well-worn mental pathways that are in line with those thought habits. I bring this up because most folks don't even recognize at the start of therapy what it is that they're thinking. They don't recognize that they're really even having thoughts. They'll simply say, something happened and I got angry. Something happened and I got sad. And they don't recognize that in the middle there is a thought. So, cognitive restructuring, first step, understanding what it is you're thinking. Typically, once we develop the skills to understand what it is that someone is thinking, we can then start to do what's called disputing those thoughts. So, a central tenet of cognitive behavioral theory is that thoughts that produce negative emotions are typically not rational. And people tend to go, oh, not rational. What do you mean? I'm irrational? And what I mean is we've developed certain habits of thought sort of uncritically, and we may say things to ourselves in our mind that are not really in line with reality, and they tend to generate very negative responses. So let's imagine a situation where a loved one has died, and I'm having the thought, life is no longer worth living. Well, that's going to generate a very depressive thought, or very depressive emotions, and maybe some very scary behaviors if I perseverate and get stuck in that loop of thinking that life is no longer worth living. In CBT, in cognitive restructuring, we would identify that thought, and then we would come up with a disputed thought, something along the lines of, I feel the loss of this person that I loved very keenly. That is a thought that accurately reflects the truth of the situation and isn't mired in irrationality, which produces this very negative outcome. So, cognitive restructuring, learning to identify thoughts, and then learning to dispute them is the first aspect of CBT. The second aspect of CBT is called behavioral activation. And behavioral activation can be thought of as essentially behavioral experiments. An example I give is that I had a client who was very anxious in social context, a lot of social anxiety, and he wanted to work on this. So the time came when he had an invite to a party, and he was very anxious about going to this party. And so we started talking about, well, what are the thoughts that you're having? Why is this making you anxious? What is the thought that is generating that emotion? And the thought was he had this image of himself sitting or standing in the party up against a wall. Nobody wants to talk to him. Maybe he makes a vain attempt to talk to somebody and they ignore him. And then he slinks away out the back door, never to come back again because he's so humiliated by the fact that nobody wants to talk to him. So what we did is I asked him to engage in a behavioral experiment. I asked him to write down for me exactly what he told me. This is what is going to happen if I go to this party. And I had him put that in his pocket. And then he went to the party, and he was brave enough and courageous enough to go do that. He went to the party, and then I asked him after the party to write down how it actually made him feel to go to the party. This is behavioral activation. This is teaching somebody that perhaps what their mind predicts as a response to that behavior, or as a response to that behavior, isn't actually what's going to happen. Another aspect of behavioral activation is simply getting folks to do stuff that they don't want to do, but they know have provided them with joy in the past. So, for example, if I'm depressed, and I love riding my mountain bikes, if I was very depressed, maybe I would lose track of that as something I loved and enjoyed in my past. So, a good therapist would help you identify that, hey, you used to really enjoy these 4 or 5 things in the past. What if we did those things again to see if that helped alter your mood? Because depression, of course, convinces you not to do anything, and you are deprived of these things that make you feel good. So behavioral activation is reintegrating things that you know make you feel good, and it's using behavior to kind of push on the cognition part. Whereas thoughts can influence behavior, also introducing behaviors can influence thoughts. So the third aspect that we want to talk about very briefly, I'm running out of time here, is exposure therapy. Exposure therapy is a process whereby we gradually introduce someone to a very anxiety-provoking stimuli to teach them that they don't really need to be anxious about this. So a quick example of this was a client that I had that was very anxious about going outside of her apartment. She was It was very difficult for her to come into my office, and I actually came with permission. I came to her house to treat her, and one of the things that we did is we engaged in some exposure therapy, where I would ask her to think, just sit there and think about going outside and rate her anxiety, and it would of course be, let's say, 10 or 9 on a scale of 1 to 10. So we would sit with that anxiety, and she would simply feel that anxiety and potentially engage in some coping mechanisms, some breathing to kind of bring her anxiety down. And over time, she could hold the thought of going outside in her head and only maybe feel like a 3 on the scale of anxiety from 1 to 10. So after she kind of got down to below 5, 3, 2, 3 area, we would bring it up a notch and take her to the door, for example, and same thing would ensue. Oh man, my anxiety is at a 9. And we would gradually expose her to that anxiety. And over time, as you escalate these things slowly and carefully with the client, over time, she became capable of going outside again. She became capable of coming to the office again. This is the benefit of exposure therapy. And then finally, skills training, which we've kind of talked about a little bit, integrated with all the other ones. But effectively, it's stuff like learning to identify the thoughts you're having, learning to dispute those thoughts, learning to be brave and engage in behavioral activation. What are some behavioral interventions that I can do on myself to help me improve my mood? And another example of this is like mindfulness and meditation training. I found that with mindfulness and meditation training, it has a dual benefit. One of them is, so the nature of mindfulness training is such that you focus on the present moment by focusing on bodily stimuli, my breathing, focusing on the tingling I might be feeling on my face or the pressure I might be feeling on my back. And of course, after some time, your mind sort of goes to other things and it starts thinking other thoughts. And then you realize that you're thinking other thoughts. You go, oh my gosh, let me come back to the moment and come back to those physical stimuli and get grounded in the moment. And that back and forth is mindfulness meditation. So I find that when folks engage in this training, they recognize two things. One, it helps them identify the thoughts that they're having. And two, it helps them to engage in coping skills that bring down their anxiety. So those are the 4 aspects or the 4 tenets of CBT. The first one in review is cognitive restructuring. That's learning to identify the thoughts you're having and learning to dispute them. The second is behavioral activation, where we engage in behavioral experiments to see if that improves our mood or not. The third is exposure therapy in the cases of people that have anxieties or phobias. And finally, overall skills training to help improve mood and help people navigate through life. So that, in a nutshell, very quickly, is the basis of CBT. And if you'd like to hear about any specific part of that, or if any other items of interest crop up in your mind, please tell me down in the comments. I would love to respond to it there. And I hope this has been helpful to you.